Okay, I think we're live. Today I just wanted to finish Surah 42. Excuse me. The Counsel. Thanks for anyone who will join us, even though I don't think anyone's here at the moment, but, well, one person. And missing out on the USC-Oregon game. I think USC is ahead by 7, but that was 10 minutes ago, so the score might have changed in the interim. Thanks for watching. So I think we ended the last video describing how Allah is benignant, how he's merciful and helpful to his servants, which presumably includes Allah. And I demonstrated how that's not the case, and I'll actually come back to that. I'll come back to that very shortly, but I wanted to address, hi, Corins. I want to address verse 23, where it says, "That is of which Allah gives the good news to his servants, to those who believe and do good deeds." Again, emphasizing works, not just simply belief in Allah, but works and good deeds, like many false gospels. And say, "I do not ask of you any reward for it, but love for my near relatives and whoever earns good. We give him more of good therein. Surely Allah is forgiving, grateful." And this is interesting because there's a surah, and we went over the surah in one of my earlier videos called "The Spoils of War." So this is Surah 8, and the first verse of this surah states, they ask you about the windfalls. Now, when he says the windfalls, Muhammad is talking about the spoils of war, hence the title, The Spoils of War. So he says, "Say the windfalls are for Allah and the apostle, i.e. Muhammad. So be careful of your duty to Allah and settle right matters of your difference, and obey Allah and his apostle if you are believers." Now, the context of this verse is, this is obviously a Medinan surah. This is after Muhammad officially became a warlord, and he started attacking caravans, him and his followers, plundering people, basically acting as pirates. As you see, the Somali pirates, what they do, the pirates in the Malacca Straits several years ago, there was a huge piracy problem in Indonesia and that area of the Pacific, and they were essentially pirates. They were, in order to fund their attacks on Mecca and defeat the Quraysh and other tribes and seize power, Muhammad and his followers would simply raid caravans and attack caravans and use the profits to defray the costs of their military, their armies. And this is why, by the time Muhammad enters Mecca, he ostensibly has 10,000 followers. He has a huge army of followers who are dependent upon all of the ill-gotten gains from these various, basically from piracy, from attacking different tribes and plundering and sacking towns and cities in the Arabian Peninsula. And this is something that was served as the template for Islam from that point on to today, onto the 21st century. And this is why groups like ISIS, like Boko Haram, like Al-Qaeda, whenever they are able to take over a territory, they exact tribute from the people there, attacks. The Taliban did this with opium growers. Opium is one of the few really um, really lucrative crops in Afghanistan, and this is why 80 to 90% of the heroin comes from that part of the world, because they have opium fields. And when the Taliban were in control of the country, they exacted a tax on farmers who grew opium. And it's why ISIS, when they established the Islamic State, they would use the proceeds from oil smuggling and the land that they had taken over in order to fund their expansion. This is all perfectly valid according to Islamic doctrine, and it's based on the life of Muhammad. So, to get back to Surah 42, when it says, I do not ask you of any reward but for love of my near relatives and whoever earns good. Um, you have to contrast that with Surah 11:29, and let's turn there right now. Here it goes. And it says, and O my people, I ask you not for wealth in return for it. My reward is only with Allah. And I am not going to drive away those who believe. Surely they shall meet their Lord, but I consider you a people who are ignorant. So here, again, just like in Surah 42, in Surah 11, he's saying, I don't want any reward. And I analogized it in a previous video to the Levites, the tribe of Levi. They were the one tribe that didn't have a land allotted to them. Out of the 12 tribes, the tribe of Levi didn't, because their reward was God. They served God, so they were. And this is why this is why the sacrifices, a certain portion were set aside for them, because they served God in the tabernacle and the temple, and that was their reward. So I kind of analogized it to that, but it but Muhammad, he's saying that in one verse, and in an entire surah, which is just based on the idea that you should give something you capture. In this case, war booty. You should just give it to Muhammad, not just monetary monetary compensation, but also the wives, the slave girls, the women that you enslaved after killing their husband, as in the case of the Battle of Khaybar, when he murdered all of the Jewish adult males. You should give a fifth of that to Muhammad, and by doing that, you're essentially giving it to Allah. Well, Muhammad, Allah is Muhammad's alter ego in the Quran. So when you hear Allah talking, but there are points where Muhammad interposes himself. That's one of the problems with the Quran. It's difficult. It's so incoherent, and it's so jumbled together. It's difficult to find the narrative voice. But in this case, Muhammad is saying, essentially, in the same book, he's saying, my reward is only with Allah. That's Muhammad. My reward is only with Allah. Also, Muhammad, you should give a fifth of all war booty to me, and the windfalls are only for me and Allah. And if you dispute that, you're you're just a demon. You're horrible. You're not a real Muslim if you challenge my entitlement to all of this all of this plunder. So again, this is a huge this is a huge contradiction. And like I said, the Quran is filled with contradictions. Okay, thought I froze for a second. The Quran is filled with contradictions, but this is one of the biggest ones because you have Muhammad saying in the same book, my reward is with Allah, but also I deserve this other reward, which is loot and women and all of these things that I helped to steal through warfare. So I just wanted to focus on that. That's probably that's one of the main takeaways from this surah. So back to the point I made in the last video, in verse 30, it says, and whatever affliction befalls you, it is on account of what your hands have wrought, and yet he pardons most of your faults. And this is interesting that there's a caveat here, because if you look at this statement, whatever affliction befalls you is on account of what your hands wrought, and you applied it to Allah, see, even I get confused. If you applied it to Muhammad, you would have to say that his death was his fault. And David Wood points out the stupidity of Muhammad after the Battle of Khaybar, after he killed all of these Jewish, all of the adult males in this tribe. He had one of the women, one of the widows of a man that he killed, he had her serve him lamb, and she poisoned it, and he died an agonizing death over the next several years, and he died in agony. So Muslims, according to their theology, they think that afflictions, diseases, material afflictions, physical ailments, natural disasters, all of these things are a reflection of Allah's disfavor. So if you get sick, if you get cancer, if you get a disease, that's because you've done something wrong. And anyone who's read the Bible, anyone who's, even if they've just read the book of Job, they would understand how this idea is completely unscriptural. There's no biblical basis to support this idea that if you're afflicted in this life, that that's somehow a reflection of God, of God's enmity, that he has a problem with what you've done or that you've sinned. So, I mean, the entire book of Job refutes this idea, but also the Gospels. Jesus repeatedly rejects this idea, and this was something that the Pharisees were infatuated with, this idea that if you're suffering, it's because either you or someone in your family, your descendants, sinned, that those sins, the wrath of those sins are being visited upon you in some way. And Jesus completely rejected that and demonstrated it through miraculous healings of people who were deaf, his healing of the paralytic, his healing of the blind, of lepers. So this is something that is completely fundamentally unscriptural, but it's something that Muslims are obsessed with because they base it on the Quran, and it doesn't even make much sense according to, if you apply this philosophy consistently, you would have to say that Allah doesn't like Muslims because, for example, to just use one illustration, the tsunami that destroyed large parts of Phuket, of Sri Lanka, but also Aceh, Indonesia. That island, that was one of the worst hit islands in the Indonesian archipelago. And Aceh is one of the most fanatically Muslim places that you'll find. In fact, after the tsunami, they enacted Sharia. They enacted Sharia in order to placate the Muslims. It's not like Java, which still has a huge residual Buddhist and Hindu influence. It's not like other parts of Indonesia where there's a large percentage of Catholics. Aceh is probably the most obsessively Islamist part of Indonesia, and yet that was the part of Indonesia that was completely obliterated, a large part of it, during the Asian tsunami many years ago. Yet the conclusion Muslims drew from this is that they weren't being Muslim enough, that they needed to be more fanatically devoted to the Quran and start imposing all sorts of Sharia inflected punishments on people, kind of like the Hudud laws in Pakistan. That was the conclusion they draw, even though it was already one of the most retrograde, obsessively Muslim parts of that entire country, and it was the part of the country that was most devastated by the tsunami. So the logical conclusion, if you were operating with this belief system, would be that Allah doesn't like Muslims, but they drew the conclusion that they needed to be more obsessively attuned to the finer points of the Quran and the Hadith, which doesn't make any sense. But where it says whatever affliction befalls you is on account of what your own hands have wrought, this is an indictment of Muhammad, because, like I said, he died at the hands of a woman whose husband he killed, and he was poisoned and died a miserable death. If you were going to apply the philosophies of Islam systemically applied to Muslims themselves, then it would disprove Islam, and it would definitively prove that Muhammad was a false prophet. Because as I said in as I said in the last video, Muhammad predicted that he wouldn't die. He said that he wouldn't die. This was in the aftermath of being poisoned. According to the Hadith, he said that this woman shouldn't be punished like Muhammad's other critics who were murdered by his disciples. He said she shouldn't be murdered because this wouldn't result in his death. And of course, like many other things, he was completely and totally wrong, because he wound up dying a miserable death a couple of years later. So one, this proves that Muhammad was a false prophet, because he said if his aorta was severed, that he would that if his aorta was severed, he basically said, that would be proof that he was a false prophet. He said this before his death, obviously. But the fact that subsequent to that, he died exactly as he predicted a false prophet would die, this is concrete evidence that Muhammad was a false prophet. But it's also evidence that here, this verse, whatever affliction befalls you, is an account of what your hands have wrought. This is also proof that Islam as a theology is defective. It just doesn't work. So in 37 it says, and those who shun the great sins and indecencies, and whenever they are angry they forgive, and those who respond to their Lord and keep up prayer, and their rule is to take counsel among themselves, and who spend out of what we have given them, and those who, when great wrong afflicts them, defend themselves, and the recompense of evil is punishment like it. But whoever forgives and amends, he shall have his reward from Allah. Surely he does not love the unjust. And there are a number of things to take from this. Initially, where it says, and those who shun the great sins and indecencies. And this is another strange aspect of Islam. It has this bizarre system of weighting different sins. So the Quran says that Allah, and in an earlier surah, I pointed this out, the Quran says that Allah will forgive minor sins if you don't commit great sins. So great sins presumably are what you would think of as mortal sins. There's in Roman Catholic theology, there's a distinction between dying impenitently while having committed mortal sins, and committing venial sins, which are less grave. So something like blasphemy would be a mortal sin. And in the Bible, there is an unforgivable sin that Jesus describes after the Pharisees accuse him of casting out. They essentially accuse him of being a one with the devil because of his ability to cast out demons, and they accuse him of working these miracles in the name of Satan. They're not denying that these things are miracles. They're just saying that he did them because he's empowered by Satan. He's not doing them in the name of God. He's doing them in the name of Satan. And he says that they're on the verge of committing the unforgivable sin. But Islam has an entire gradation of different sins. And in the Quran, it says that Allah will forgive minor sins if you don't commit grave sins. So a grave sin in this case would be usually it's associated with shirk, or associating things with Allah. So someone who claims that Jesus is God, or that he's the Son of God, he would be committing a grave sin, or one of the worst sins. So Allah would not be able to forgive that. But if you simply commit everyday sins, then maybe he'll, but still do the Hajj and do the 5 pillars and don't believe that Jesus was God, then maybe you'll be all right with Allah. But that's basically a part of Muslim theology, this idea of not doing grave or great sins, but being able to get away with minor or lesser sins, in contrast with the biblical idea of confessing your sins and seeking forgiveness. And those who respond to their Lord and keep up prayer and their urge to take consequences. And the recompense of evil is punishment like it, but whoever forgives and amends, he shall have his reward with Allah. Surely he does not love the unjust. And I'm just going to read briefly from Matthew 5:44 to contrast this with the teachings of Jesus. So in Matthew 5:43, it says, "Ye have heard it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust." So this is, and I'll just finish it. "For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." And this is in complete contrast to Islam, which would say that loving someone who is Muslim is perfectly acceptable and that should be encouraged, and actually discourages loving people who are non-Muslim. So before the Bible, there was a prohibitive version of the golden rule. When people think of the golden rule, they think of, particularly as it as it as it's expressed in Jesus's teaching, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So this is an affirmative version of the golden rule, not simply don't do things that you wouldn't want to have done to you, which is something that's existed even in pre-biblical cultures. So it's expressed in Leviticus, and it's reaffirmed and strengthened by Jesus in his teachings. This idea of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, and but in other words, um, acting in a way that that you would want want other people to act, even if they don't accept your even if they don't accept it. So in other words, like even if people are mean spirited towards you or despitefully use you, in Jesus' words, even if they do that, you should still act towards them with forgiveness or compassion, or at least try to extend to them the benefit that they haven't granted you. So the negative version of that, or the prohibitive version of the golden rule, would be, don't, if you don't want to be attacked or cursed or beaten up, don't do that. But that's, when you think about it, that's not too much to ask of someone. Just things that you don't want to have happen to you, don't do that to other people. That's pretty basic. Unless you're a sociopath or a psychopath, that's pretty much how most people in a normal society would react. They wouldn't, if you don't want someone to punch you in the face, you're not going to go around punching someone in the face again, unless you're a psychopath. But the difference is the message of Moses and Jesus, who affirmed this and then enhanced it, is you should treat people the way you would want to be treated, despite however they treat you. In other words, regardless of how they would react, or how they operate towards other human beings, you should still treat them that way. This is this is one of the great parts of Jesus's message, and it's in stark contrast to Muhammad, who operates under the assumption that you're only going to treat people who are like you in a compassionate, or not even a compassionate, but in a fair manner. In other words, you're only going to extend the benefit of the doubt to people who are Muslim. Oh, I'm sorry about that. But I just wanted to make that point, because in the Quran, you're told to help Muslims, to give charity to Muslims. The whole idea of zakat. It's not, you're not expected to give charity or help to people who are not Muslims, to people who are poor but are Christians or Hindus or Buddhists. and this is something that completely contradicts the gospel, which again, treat people with mercy and with and give people the benefit of the doubt, and try to, whenever possible, whenever it's possible. Again, you're not going to do you're not going to this doesn't mean, invite a murderer over to your house for dinner or something, but just in other words, just with ordinary people, treat them the way you would want to be treated, and do that without an expectation of that being reciprocated. In other words, just because you're polite or decent to someone, don't expect that person to be decent in return. So in 50 it says, or he in 49 it says, Allah is the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. He creates what he pleases. He grants to whom he pleases daughters and grants to whom he pleases sons, or he makes them of both sorts, male and female, and he makes whom he pleases barren. Surely he is the knowing, the powerful. And this is funny because this is just another example of Muhammad stating the obvious, that 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 someone who is born male is a male, and someone who's born female is a female, and he's just basically re restating some he's stating something that's obvious, that he doesn't need any elaboration, and he's using it as some sort of in, in an attempt to demonstrate that Allah should be worshipped as God. In other words, he's pointing to something or reality, and then drawing the conclusion that this means Allah is God, and therefore, if Allah is God, then then I am his prophet, and therefore you should follow me and worship Allah. And again, this is just another logical fallacy. He's not demonstrating, if a in logic, if a or p plus q equals pq, or he's not going through any sort of deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning, for that matter. He's just simply stating something that's true and saying, therefore Allah is God and I'm his prophet. But there's no connective tissue linking this observation, which is, some people are born male and some people are born female. There's no connection between that observation and the conclusion that he draws, that Allah is God and I am his prophet and you should follow me and worship Allah. He's just simply saying, hey, look, there's trees, therefore Allah, you should worship Allah. There's no there's just no systemic argument here. It's not like Paul, where in Acts 17 he goes onto the Areopagus and he makes a very detailed, incisive argument for the gospel, and he goes through all of these things. He even uses Greek poets like Epimenides, uses their philosophy in order to get them to understand the existence of the true God and why all of these idols are false. He makes a very persuasive carefully constructed argument, whereas Muhammad is just simply s- stating facts that have nothing to do with Islam and drawing a very through through very circuitous reasoning, saying that this is why Islam is true. And you find this throughout the entire Quran. And it is not for any mortal that Allah should speak to him except by revelation or from behind a veil or by sending a messenger and revealing by his permission what he pleases. Surely he is high, wise. And this is simply something that's unscriptural. God repeatedly speaks to people directly. He spoke to them most importantly through his son. And the epistle to the Hebrews is a great illustration of how God speaks to people. So if you just read the first few verses, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high, being made so much better than the angels, as he hath by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. So God spoke to us through Jesus Christ, his son. But even before that, he spoke to people repeatedly. In Genesis 18, Abraham, he spoke to him directly. And Genesis 18 is also a great chapter illustrating that you can find the Trinity throughout the entire Bible. It's not just something that was invented by the disciples of Jesus Christ or created by the Roman Catholic Church or whatever sort of conspiracy theory anti-Trinitarians would espouse. It's throughout the Bible, so you can find God speaking in Genesis 18, in Genesis 32 to Jacob. You can find God. You can find God speaking to Moses. You can find him speaking throughout the entire Old and New Testament. So this idea that he has to be behind a veil, the veil is rent. There's no, especially after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the veil was torn. But even before that, the idea that God didn't speak to people, that he didn't have any sort of relationship beyond what the prophet said is not, strictly speaking, accurate. And in 52 it says, "And thus did we reveal to you an inspired book by our command. You did not know what the book was, nor what the faith was, but we made it a light, guiding thereby whom we please of our servants. And most surely you show the way to the right path, the path of Allah, whose is whatsoever is in the heavens and whatsoever is on the earth. Now surely to Allah do all things eventually come." And there are a number of things that are wrong with this. First of all, the Quran is not inspired. Well, first of all, even Muslims don't claim that the Quran is inspired. They claim the Quran was literally created by God and given to Muhammad through the angel Jibril or Gabriel. So even Muslims don't claim it's inspired. The Bible is inspired. It's inspired by the Holy Spirit, and it was written by men who were inspired by the Holy Spirit, and that's how we have the that's how we have the Bible. That's how we have the Pentateuch, and the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Gospels. But Muslims don't say that. Muslims claim that the Bible was created, the Quran rather, is some sort of eternal book, which creates a conflict because it clashes with their other very deeply held belief in Tawheed. But putting that aside for a moment, Muslims don't claim that the Quran is inspired. Secondly, the Quran isn't inspired. And this series has proven that, just pointing out all of the incredibly glaring contradictions and errors and heresies that contain in the Quran. But also the idea that people did not have faith before this is really bizarre when you stop and think about it. I mean, before the 5 books of Moses, or Musa, as he's called in the Quran, people had faith. I mean, Abraham is called the father of faith. That's how he's in Hebrews 11, which is sometimes called the Hall of Faith, a book which describes the deeply held faith of all of the patriarchs and prophets and men and women who suffered for worshiping the true God, the living God. So faith existed. Faith predates the Bible, um, but it also is completely inapplicable in this case because the Quran rejects the idea of grace. It rejects the idea of salvation by faith. So this entire paragraph is wrong on this entire passage is wrong on so many different levels, but I just wanted to end with this. It says, the path of Allah, whose is whatsoever is in the heavens and whatsoever is in the earth. Now surely to Allah do all affairs eventually come. And this is another bromide that you keep hearing in the Quran. Leave everything to Allah. You should Allah will ultimately be the arbiter of these disputes and these matters, but it contradicts the way Muslims operate as an ummah, as a religion. Islam is jealously protects the image of Muhammad, and the Quran, particularly, to the extent that they actually go out and attack and persecute people, anyone who impugns the character of Muhammad or says something negative about the Quran. So while on some level the Quran is saying you should leave these things up to Allah, Muslims are so defensive about, they're rightfully so, because the Quran is a ridiculous book, and the truth claims of the Quran cannot withstand any serious scrutiny. So they're so defensive that they go out and try to persecute anyone who questions the Quran or critiques the Quran or impugns the motivations or the character of Muhammad. So this is another case of it just being a clear contradiction in this book. This idea that Muhammad keeps referring to Allah and how Allah is ostensibly sovereign over everything, but at the same time you need to protect Allah, you need to protect his image, and you need to protect the reputation of Muhammad by going out and persecuting anyone who slanders, i.e., tells the truth about Islam. So again, this is one of one of the main contradictions of Islam. Uh, so that's the end of Surah 42. Surah 43, the embellishment. Some of these are actually pretty amusing, the titles for these surahs, but the embellishment is the next surah. And after that, the surahs get pretty concise, 3 pages or less, all the way up until the end, which is 6 sentences. But I'll tackle that surah in my next video. Thanks everyone for joining. Irene, Corrence, Inky, Love and Light, Up with God. I think GW was here earlier. Yeah. Hi, Malachi. Thanks for that. And anyone else who is watching, yeah, feel free to like or share, definitely, if you found this video edifying. All right. I'll see you next time. Night.